Hi, if you've barely started learning Gaelic, one of the questions you might have is why is it Madainn va but feasgar ma? Why is there that difference? If you've been learning for a while, you may already know that the answer to this is gender. But that alone doesn't explain why. That just puts a word, a name on it. So what I want to do today is just speak briefly about how gender works in Gaelic and give you part of the bigger picture. So this isn't going to be an exhaustive list of rules that you need to remember to understand gender in Scottish Gaelic. So let's start looking at that example. So we have Madainn va for good morning and feasgar ma for good afternoon. Now we can look at another pair where this same contrast occurs. So we have oiche va and we have la ma. Now oiche va for good night and la ma for good day. What a lot of people get confused at here is they'll look at la and feasgar and say, well, why is la like feasgar? And then why is oiche like madainn? Why is the night like the morning and why is the evening or the afternoon like the day? That's not quite how it works. To really understand this, we've got to look a little bit further east than you might expect, because this is the concept from Eastern philosophy of yin and yang. The yin-yang is about two apparent opposites that complement each other and together form a whole. So the morning, the sun's going up, and the evening, the sun's coming down. So they are opposites, but together they form the whole of the daylight hours. So they are two parts of a whole, complementary opposites. And the same goes for oiche and la. So night and day, you've got the dark and the light parts of the 24-hour day cycle. Together they make the whole 24 hours, two complementary opposites. So this is about putting things in a category. If we look back, it's not that oiche is in the same category as madainn, really. It's that oiche is in the opposite category from la. Night and day are opposites, so they are in different categories. Category, another word that you might know for category. Genre from French. We use it to talk about categories of fiction, categories of literature. So genres of books, genres of films, genres of computer games. Now there's another word I'd like you to look at here. Generic. Generic means that it's an adjective we use to describe something as being very standard for the genre it's in. A very typical example of its category. Now a related word to this is general. And if you see in the phrase in general, when you talk about people in general, you're talking about people as a category. Not people as individuals, but people in general as a category. These words all come from the same Latin word root, a word that means category. And another word we have in English from that same Latin root is gender. Gender originates in a Latin word meaning category. So how do we get to the point where we are today where it means something different? Well, Latin is related to the Celtic language family. Go back several thousand years, fair enough, but it is related. So the concept of these categories we call gender originates many thousands of years ago in the language. It was the Romans that put a name to it, and here we're talking about just this yin and yang category. Let's have a look at this a little bit further. So we had our Madainn mhath, our feasgar mhath, aiche mhath, la mhath, comparisons, two halves of a whole. Now, to modern society, this doesn't hold, but to our ancestors, where reproduction, breeding, continuation of the species was absolutely vital. I mean, if you didn't have a pension plan, you needed your children to look after you. So to early humans, it was very clear and obvious that biological sex was an important categorization between human beings. So, of course, they saw them as the yin and the yang, the two complementary parts of the human whole. So if we have girl, nian, nian va, whereas for a boy, balach ma, a good boy. So they're in the two opposite categories. Now, when it came to the Romans putting a name on these categories, they put the name on them that they saw as being most important. They named it by not the property of the category, but the fact that the categories contained things that were important to them. And the most important things to humans are humans. So words relating to humans became key. So we call these categories feminine and masculine, not because the night is somehow like a woman and the day is somehow like a man, or that the morning is like a woman and the evening or afternoon is like a man, but because morning and night are in the same box as women, and evening and day are in the same box as men. These are just labels of convenience. They don't tell us anything about the nature of the words within. Here we have two categories in the language, but that doesn't mean we only have one way of categorizing. This is only our first means in which Gaelic has categorized words, and that was, as I said, the yin and yang. But there are other ways of categorizing. When I present this to my students, when I present them the yin and yang, one of the questions that sometimes comes up is, well, does that mean the moon and the sun are in different categories? Gaelach for the moon, Grian for the sun. It could, but if you think about it, I used to get very confused as a child about all these books that would talk about the moon coming out at night and the sun coming out in the daytime. And I would look up in the sky in an afternoon and see the moon, because the moon is not only visible in night. It's not the opposite of the sun. It's just different. And Gaelic doesn't see these as opposites. Gaelic instead sees them as things that are up in the sky. And there are other things up in the sky. For example, rail for star or planich for planet. So Gaelic sees these things as being similar and being the same category. They're all in a category we can sum up in English with the phrase heavenly bodies. Now, they don't get their own grammatical gender just because they're their own category. We've categorized them together, and now we've got to put them in a box. But the decision was to put them in the same box as women, the box labelled feminine. Okay, so now to add to our principle of yin and yang, we can add a second principle, that like goes with like. Certain categories of words go together. Another example that some of my students will bring up when I talk about the yin and yang will be the very classic yin and yang one, light and dark. Solus is the Gaelic for light. Dorachithus is the Gaelic for dark. To think these would be yin and yang is pretty natural, because the yin and yang symbol is the black and white, the dark and the light. But Gaelic hasn't gone that way. And to show you why, I'll bring up another couple of words. Cianalus. It's a word meaning homesickness, a painful longing for something you're missing. Tacartus is an event. Now these are quite random seeming words. They have nothing to do with light and darkness. But you may have noticed that Solus and Dorachatus and Kianalus and Tacartus all end with AS. They end with the same letters, the same syllable. This is no coincidence. This is a group of words that go together. And these particular ones are in masculine. There are certain endings that are masculine and there are certain endings that are feminine. The AS, they're all masculine. So this gives us, in addition to our yin and yang, our like with like rules, we have a third principle of categorization. We can categorize by word endings, a form class. So we categorize with yin and yang, pairs of opposites. Like with like, things that have similar meaning or similar senses. Word endings, things that have the same form. Now there's one other principle that you can use to categorize Gaelic words by gender. This is quite a simple one. If you look at these words, car, phone, television, helicopter, well, what do they all have in common? Quite simply, they have all been borrowed very recently from English. And if a word has been in the language less than 100 years, there's a good chance that unless it describes something female, a female person or a female animal, very, very good chance it's going to be masculine in Gaelic. So anything that's been borrowed in recently. Now this may trip you up from time to time because you may come across a word that you think has been borrowed in recently but has actually been in the language longer. For example, chocolate, meaning chocolate. That's been in the language longer than you might expect, and it is in fact feminine because it is not a recent borrowing. If it's an older borrowing, it could be either, and that will just depend on what it sounds like. So now we have 4 categories. So to add to our yin and yang, our opposites, to add to our like with like, categories of related vocabulary, and to add to our form, our grammatical group, where they have the same ending, we can now talk about recent borrowings. So these 4 categories don't always let you predict what the gender of a word is. The recent borrowings does. The word endings, well, yes, if you have seen it before at the same ending on a different word, then you will be able to predict. The like with like, well, you need to be told which of these are groups, and you will hopefully find these as you go. You'll be told when you encounter them. The yin and yang, here really you're talking about just a few very core concepts, and you will see these and you will notice them. And that's what I'm expecting from this, is not that you will be able to predict anything, but that when you see them, when you see these patterns in real use, knowing the pattern there will help you to learn the vocabulary once you accept that it's part of this pattern. Now, the thing is that not all nouns in Gaelic follow one of these principles. Some of them, they're just what they are. They had to go in a box, they went in a box. So do not be surprised if at some point you come across words that have no meaningful categorization. They are just in a box. And just think of the masculine and feminine as just names on the box. When you learn the words and you practice the words, you won't even have to think about this. The labels are just here to help you as a learner. Use them to remind yourself and to train yourself to say things right. I hope that's been helpful, and I'll speak to you again soon. Cheery and draste. Bye for now.